Gentlemen, welcome to this very special session, the Loris Williams Memorial Lecture. My name is Marcia Langton. I'm the Associate Provost of the University of Melbourne, and it's my very great honour to welcome you here to this session. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri traditional owners of the Kulin Nations. We have a wonderful relationship with the Wurundjeri elders, and I'm glad that I think it was young Alex who was able to come here and welcome you to country. First of all, before the session begins, I'd like to welcome Rebecca Bateman, the Manager of Indigenous Services at the National Archives, to say a few words about the late Loris Williams and a very special acknowledgement of her work in Canberra. Rebecca.
Thank you. Hi everyone. As Marcia said, I'm Rebecca Bateman and I am the Manager of Indigenous Services at the National Archives of Australia. I'm based in Canberra. Some of you may be aware that we also have a Koori Reference Officer down here in our Melbourne office, Georgia, who's sitting over there today, and we also have some Indigenous staff up in our Northern Territory office. Is that better? Can people hear me? Okay. What I wanted to talk to you about today, without taking up too much of the precious time that we have for the lecture, is about, first of all, a bit about Loris, and about a room that we've named for her at the National Archives in Canberra. Before I do, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the country that we're on, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'm an Indigenous woman from the Walewan and Gamilaroi groups of northwest New South Wales, and I live in Canberra on Ngambri Ngunnawal country, which is a very great honour to do. It's a beautiful country, as is the country of the Kulin Nation. So in Canberra, we've recently, some of you will be aware that we've recently opened our new building that we call the NAP, which stands for the National Archives Preservation Facility. Basically, it's a new, amazing, purpose-built, huge building to hold our records in Canberra and things like conservation, all the records management side of things all happen out there. Now, when we were moving into the new building, we were made aware that there were 5 meeting rooms that were to be available in the new building, and that they were to be named after people who were, highly esteemed and prominent in the archives world, particularly in their contribution to the National Archives. And a lot of thought was put into who those rooms would be named after, and 5 highly esteemed people were chosen, including, much to my delight and pride as both a member of staff at the National Archives, but also an Indigenous person working in archives, Loris Williams. So for those of you who don't know, and I know a lot of you here did know Loris and knew her well and loved her well, as most everybody who knew Loris did. Loris was a Queensland woman of the Gubbi Gubbi and Waka Waka Nations, and she was the first Aboriginal person in Queensland to be a qualified archivist, and she was the second in Australia after the lovely Kirsten over here. Loris was really very, very instrumental in both encouraging other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into the profession, and in opening up the doors of archives and record-keeping organisations across the nation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who wanted to access those records, and helping them to know what's there and how to access them. So she was very, very much a forerunner in this, and very much somebody that I think I could speak for myself and probably a number of other people is someone that you aspire to when you're working in that field. And we did the most utmost of respect. So it was amazing that we could name this room after her. So on the screen you can see some photos of what the NAF looks like. This is the Loris Williams room, and we thought it was really important to acknowledge who the room was named after and why. And we did that by selecting a number of photographs from our collection that sort of reflect Loris's passions and the work that she did and that she's remembered for. So from left, actually, we have an image related to the handover of Uluru back to the traditional owners. We have, this relates to the National Aboriginal Consultative Council elections. So just a few more. So I just wanted to let people know that we're very proud to have the Loris Williams room and to have named it in her honour.
So now I'd like to hand over to this extraordinary team of people here, and the person I'm handing over to is Dr. Ricardo Punzalan, and he's the Assistant Professor of Archives and Co-Chair of the Graduate Program in Museum Scholarship and Material Culture at the University of Maryland, College Park. But I'll let him introduce himself beyond that, and a very warm welcome to all of you, especially to those of you who've travelled so far to come here and join this conference, and I look forward to talking to you later. So over to you, Dr. Punzalan.
Good morning. I'm truly grateful to be here and to be amongst exemplary colleagues, international colleagues at that, I think. I'm, aside from teaching at the University of Maryland in the United States, I'm also currently the chair of the Native American Archives section of the Society of American Archivists. We have about 800 membership in that section. And I'm, for the next 2 years, in charge of a very huge responsibility. And I take it seriously, and I find it to be an honorable position that's been to be elected at, and so the goal for me is to present and show the different projects that we're doing as a section within the society, and also my own personal research projects. My task is actually, Dave, you gave me 10 minutes, right? Maybe 10 minutes-ish to talk about, a kind of orientation to our panel. But before I do that, I'd like to first express my solidarity with the Lumad of the Philippines. It's an indigenous group in southern Philippines. Mindanao is currently under martial law, declared by President Rodrigo Duterte, and there are many indigenous communities in the Philippines, especially in the island of Mindanao, that are currently being displaced because of militarization, a war that they did not initiate. It's a war between basically the Christian groups of the Philippines and the Muslim group of the Philippines, and those who are caught in between are suffering as we speak. And I'd like you to, us all, to think about indigenous Filipinos. Today we have this important task of talking about impact, assessment, and digitized archives. So for my part, I'd like to introduce the notions of cultural sensitivity and cultural privacy, and the complications of providing access to digitized indigenous archives. We want us also to reflect on what it means to make an impact, and the problematic nature of assessments and evaluation, and what impact documentation and assessment might look like for the digital projects with ethnographic and indigenous content. So these are the three points that I'd like to emphasize this morning. So for a little bit of context, so yesterday when I got my bag, I saw this and I said, well, this is nice. This is one way, one way to, I don't know if you've opened your bag. It's in there, a postcard that says, don't sit on your assets. And it's basically saying digitize your historic tape and film. So I said, you know, this is perhaps the best image to show to this group of how pervasive the digitization has become, that it has become a fundamental responsibility, a kind of expectation. This particular image, I think, even is shaming all of us if we are not digitizing our assets. So, but you know, on a more serious note, Professor Paul Conway, a scholar of digitization in archives, said that large-scale digitization by commercial vendors has generated new demands and expectations that all archival materials should be digitized and put online. Archival organizations that do not have the resources to meet this demand may find themselves locked in a three-way dilemma. You are marginalized because your collections are not accessible in digital form. You are impoverished through the reallocation to digitization of fixed or declining resources. And sometimes you feel outsourced to resources and sites that can deliver acceptable digital content. So, you know, this is you know, a way to understand how archival scholars who study digitization are, you know, framing digitization of materials in collections. But for people like us who study, you know, indigenous collections, we reckon that with, you know, this notion that for indigenous collections, there's really the notion of universal access is not always 100% the way to go. That we prefer specific relationships with communities, and we move from that relationship into doing digitization projects because of many cultural sensitivity issues, especially given the difficult context of the gathering and also you know, the creation of archival materials. In the United States, we have the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which was never endorsed by the Society of American Archivists, but despite that, I would say that many in the hundreds cultural heritage institutions are actually abiding by the protocols despite the lack of endorsement. I would say that the greatest thing that ever happened to this protocol was not to be endorsed, because I do think that people started caring about the protocol and reading it and being guided by it. As chair of the section, this is the next battle for me to reintroduce the protocols and be accepted as a document by the Society of American Archivists. So under the protocols, it defines this notion of cultural sensitivity, that for Native American communities, the public release or access to specialized information or knowledge gathered with and without informed consent can cause irreparable harm to communities. And under the Code of Ethics of the Society of American Archivists, we believe that there is such a thing as cultural privacy, that privacy transcends the individual, and that specific groups or communities should be given the right to privacy over their cultural knowledge. And so now we enter this realm of impact, right? So we are digitizing at a fast rate. There's a lot of effort around perfecting the scanners, the right calibration for the machine, how gray should be gray, how pink should be pink, and also there's a lot of research around retrieval, how quickly can people access the collection. But you know, the question for our group here is, so what if you can quickly get to the item? What matters, I think, is what happens after the retrieval. Once you take the material with you and you take it home with you, what happens next? And that's real impact. That's why we abide by Simon Tanner's definition of impact, which is the measurable outcomes arising from the existence of a digital resource that demonstrate a change in the life or life opportunities of the community for which the resource is intended. So this is the question for us. As we are digitizing, what changes do we care about? What changes are we seeing because we made digital surrogates available to the public? This is another definition of impact, which is a little bit more comprehensive, that also acknowledges the negative aspect of impact, and that it also acknowledges that there's such a thing as unintended outcomes to the projects that we do, and it may result in changed attitudes, and that it should be, it may be short-term or long-term, or it may be critical or trivial. So when you say impact is about change, for whom, at what level, and when. So impact is an interesting area of research if you think about it. So we have, unfortunately, barriers to studying impact in repositories. The first being we lack the ethos of evidence-based practice and lacking a culture of assessment. There's also a mismatch between the data we have and what we want to measure or document. So it's typical for me to go to a repository and say, so what kind of metrics or assessments or toolkits do you have? And then they will say, our IT people will give us Google Analytics type of things, and we don't know what to do with them. So there's that mismatch. And at the Smithsonian, for instance, they get it every month, and people will chuck it in the cupboard because they don't know what to do with it. So that's the mismatch that I'm talking about. And sometimes we just have clear project goals in our digitization and making digital content available online. We just, most of the time, institutions are opportunistic, meaning, oh, there's funding to digitize this item, let's create a digital exhibit, and that's the goal. That's the impact, is making it up, and people are watching the exhibit. And the argument we're making is that, no, that's not impact. That's a kind of outcome. So there are efforts around impact. I will not enumerate them, but if you are interested in impact, there's a ton of resources out there. But the problem is there are no specific methods, guidelines, and systems that's appropriate for indigenous materials. And also, please keep in mind that evaluation is a major tool for shifting power among various community builders and building players and partners based on who decides how success will be defined and measured, which processes are being evaluated, who controls the dissemination of information, and especially what gets evaluated and what kinds of evidence are given credence. So if we do not start framing impact assessment and evaluation as regards to this very important collection in our repositories, somebody will do it for us, or worse, we don't know what's happening with our collection, that we might be creating more harm and damage than good. So in my own research, I've learned that these are the main changes that we care about as a profession. First, we care about knowledge, whether out of the materials that are available online, when people download them, that they are used to create knowledge, whether school children are learning from the materials, whether scientists are learning aspects of nature and environment. We care about professional discourse. Has the availability of digital assets made us a better profession? The way we describe what we do and what it means to be an archivist, is that leading to that? Are there changes in attitudes? The recent U.S. elections doesn't give that sorry, I'm inserting a lot of politics here, but but it's not providing evidence to that. My thinking is of the billions, maybe trillions of Indigenous photographs and documents that are floating on the web. Has it made us a better society, or have we been more tolerant of the other, or even understanding of what's happening in other places of the world? If digital materials are not leading towards change in attitude, why are we keep doing this? Second, the fourth is capacity. Are we better off as institutions because we make things available online? Are there more public support, for instance? Policy, not just internally around, your rules around digitization and access, rights management and all that, but also the larger policy, legislation, our politicians being informed by the materials that you have. And finally, relationships. Sometimes people like to, institutions like to digitize things, hoping that it will create some form of relationship with communities. But the argument I'm making is that, digitization must start and end with relationships. You cannot expect communities to be grateful if you did not work with them in digitizing. And I hear this a lot from professionals. I go to an institution and then they say, oh my gosh, I was hoping that they'd be happy because I made their cultural heritage available online and all we got is protest and all of that. And I said, if you have kids, that's not how you raise your child. you talk to them and you have relationships with them and you make a decision with them. You don't just tell them what to do. So yesterday, 2 days ago, we had a conversation as a group with others from different institutions here in Melbourne around, how do we do this? How do we share resources? And how do we compare our findings? And how do we create a network of scholars and practitioners interested in this area of impact research? I'm here partly because of my funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and I'm obligated to thank this federal organization. So here, I did my job. Thank you so much.
So thanks very much, Ricky. My name is Gillian Oliver. I'm the director of the Centre for Organisational and Social Informatics at Monash University. I'm a Londoner and a very recent import to Australia, but I've spent over the last 20 years or so living and working in New Zealand, and it's the New Zealand context that I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes-ish is I'll begin by just trying to explain my interest in this area and then introduce a research project that I've been working with Mark and Paul and other colleagues at the National Library of New Zealand. So as a European moving to New Zealand in the early 1990s, it was challenging, exciting, and more than a little scary to have to engage with Maori culture and protocols. So working first of all as an information management consultant with clients in local and national government, and then as an educator, Maori culture, engaging with Maori culture is not something that you can avoid. So for instance, developing curricula in information studies, that necessitated the involvement of a bicultural moderator and reviewer to ensure that the content that was being developed was sufficiently representing Indigenous perspectives and was appropriate. So perhaps it's different if you grow up in this environment, but as a newcomer, I certainly had a lot of niggling questions about the impact of these strategies and wondered what strategies actually make a difference, what difference do we want to make, what's lip service and what's effective, and horror of horrors, what's being patronising. So these questions remained unaddressed by me, and Maori perspectives unexplored by me until 2013. And then there was a juxtaposition of events which forced me to try to find a way to undertake research in this area. So in 2013, the fourth iteration of the global Inter Pares project was awarded funding by the Canadian government to explore issues of trust in the networked environment. Now, Inter Pares, this is research that's been underway since the 1990s. Very well-resourced research projects led by the University of British Columbia, investigating various aspects of digital record keeping. And the model that the Inter Pares project had developed was that, when I joined, was working in geographic teams. So we had Team Europe, Team North America, Team Latin America, etc., and Team Australasia, with Australasia signifying Australia and New Zealand. I was asked to lead Team Australasia and eventually agreed because I saw the opportunity to introduce something very unique in the pantheon of Inter Pares research, Indigenous perspectives. Now, there's a best intentions and all of that. There's a huge gap between deciding that's a good idea and negotiating with Maori partners to agree a suitable research topic. So as Pakeha, as non-Maori, as Vern was saying yesterday, you don't just barge into this space without an invitation. So there were many conversations with friends, colleagues, friends of friends, colleagues of colleagues, trying to identify a focus relating to trust that resonated with Maori and was perceived as important by them, not by me, or not necessarily by me. So eventually, perhaps, I think 18 months later, just when I was at the point of giving up, conversation with Mark and National Library colleagues led to a concrete proposal to investigate the impact of digitised Maori language resources on Maori. So how we went about this was quite an adventure. We went in a lot of ways against accepted norms for how to do research involving Indigenous communities. We broke the rules, and a bit of a sucker for breaking rules, and it was actually a lot of fun and a very rewarding and exciting process. We wanted to reach as broad an audience as possible and not restrict our research to a particular tribe or a particular segment of the community, such as academics. We wanted to go nationwide, but we had a limited amount of time and money to do this research. So the sort of the normal way to go would have been perhaps involved going on the road, conducting meetings at Marae, or inviting people to travel to Wellington for meetings, for discussion. But all of that took time and money that we didn't really have. So we decided to go with an online survey, and we developed an online survey. The development process for the survey was like everything else in this project. It took far longer than I expected, and this was because we really had to do a lot of consultation work with people's networks, with communities. So every aspect of this survey was very carefully considered and reviewed and refined again. Just when I thought we were settling on a design, we'd go back and it would be changed again. And then when the survey was distributed, we didn't attempt to restrict or count our population. We asked people to share the survey with their networks to try to broaden the reach as much as possible. The data collection phase, so after we've distributed the survey and sending out reminders for people to complete it, had a very different feel than any survey I've been involved with before. Online surveys, by their very nature, generally ensure there's a gap, there's a remoteness between the researcher and the participants, between the survey administrator and the people you want to collect information from. And this one was different. So because everything had taken longer than we thought, our timeframes were completely out, our project planning was way off, and our wonderful research assistant who'd been doing all the hard work with putting the survey together and sending it out had another commitment. She went on tour with her band, and so I took over sending out the reminders to all survey recipients to encourage them to complete the survey by our closing date. And after sending out the reminders, I was amazed by the personal email responses that I then received, with people starting conversations. So there'd be sort of like, "Kia ora, thanks for reminding me. I meant to do this but didn't get around to it. I'll get onto it now." So I'd reply and say, "Thank you very much, it's very important, blah, blah, blah." And then I'd get another response. "Oh, I've done it and I really enjoyed this part of it and this question." So it developed into a real series of conversations. So the survey process itself had a very different, much more human feel, and it was very much an interactive process. It wouldn't have happened without the very careful and extensive prior consultation and working together with community partners to make sure that the style, language, etc. were all appropriate. And I think the success of our approach can be seen most clearly in the responses, many of which are very rich and detailed. People were amazingly generous with their time, and the responses showed their efforts to really engage and work through the questions that we posed, which is my segue to Mark to talk about the responses.
Kia ora koutou, ko kapukata mahaka toko maunga, ko ofeo toko awa no otipoti aho, ko tupuna mataranga o Aotearoa toku ropu mahi, ko Mark Crookston toku ingoa, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Mark Crookston. I'm Associate Chief Librarian of the Research Collections at the Alexander Turnbull Library, part of the National Library of New Zealand. My motivations for getting involved in this project are kind of threefold. One was, from a system view perspective, I was very aware of the lack of information we had in relation to use of digital collections. When we were discussing at the library what to digitise next, prioritisations happening within the library for Māori material and material written in te reo, the Māori language. So I kind of wanted to explore that, explore kind of what was happening in the pluralised dimension of the continuum. I think we're not very aware of what goes on there. I was also getting pretty frustrated at our organisation and our sector's inability to effectively tell its value proposition. I think we measure things, as Ricky said, we measure things by, we measure our transactions really well, we measure our access counts, we measure our hits on websites, the number of things delivered to a reading room, etc. and we're really struggling to answer the so what question in response to that. So I wanted to know what was going on outside of the visibility of those transactions that the library has with our customers, our users. And the decision to focus on Te Reo Māori sort of stems from a conversation with my boss, who was stating that few things represent Mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge better than the language itself. And it was an excellent opportunity to also find some information that would better inform our engagement and relationships with Māori. So that was kind of the nexus of my thinking for getting a conversation I had with Gillian and getting involved with Interpares to get the money and the funding and get a project sort of spun up to do this work. I'm going to talk about the findings of the survey. We focused a lot on asking questions around sharing, what people have been doing with the collections. So a lot of questions about the extent to which it was shared. A lot of questions inviting people to talk about outcomes they had experienced or impacts they had experienced in their own voices. So we had a lot of narrative type questions. We also got some quantitative stuff, which is quite interesting as well. The narrative components are a little bit more complex to talk about, and I won't focus on them here. I'll finish with one. But there's kind of three key findings that I'll talk about now. The first was one that we wrapped up in the notion of a whanaungatanga. A whanaungatanga is defined as, I will read, a relationship, kinship, or sense of connection relating to a shared experience and provides a sense of belonging. It often develops as the result of an obligation. So what we were finding was that 95% of our respondents, our 85 respondents, 95% of our respondents stated that they'd shared their digitised collections with others. 60% of those that were shared were known to be shared again with someone else. 22% sourced their digitised Te Reo Māori collections not from an institution but from a friend. And 76% had received a digital Te Reo Māori collection offline, so not via the internet. So there was kind of this indication of a personal, physical kind of relationship and experience that had happened as a result of access and use of a digital thing. And this is kind of an indication of this notion of an ecosystem, or what I explained as an ecosystem, and my colleague Ariana Tikau, who was working with us, sort of took this sort of Western notion of a multiplier effect, as an accountant would say, or an ecosystem, as I was trying to explain it, and wrapped it up in this notion of whanaungatanga. So this kind of the sharing system, this engagement that was happening within communities as a result of accessing something from or someone at some stage accessing something from an institution. And that, I think, was an indication of something really kind of interesting happening in our user communities or in the people who are using, with the people who are using digitised Māori language collections. Interestingly, there was a sense of obligation that was starting to sort of come through the narrative. People were saying, oh, I had to share it with them because it related to them. It related to this person's iwi or tribe, so I felt a sense of obligation to share it as well. The rules of the library in terms of sharing digital things are pretty confusing if you're a user trying to get a sense of what you can and can't do with things, but generally we suggest not to share things. So it was, for me, who thinks that we should enable more sharing, I thought it was really interesting to note that there was this sharing system happening out there. I was also very conscious of trying to understand impacts and try and connect up our findings with some impact or some set of outcomes. So instead of making up our own ones, we connected our findings with a couple of key government strategies. And it was remarkably easy to do. So the Māori language strategy in New Zealand, a Māori language strategy 2014, had 5 outcomes, one of which was the increasing use of Māori language among whānau, or family, and other New Zealanders, especially in the home. So 76% of our respondents said that they liked being able to share collections with friends and whānau. 54% stated that their purpose of accessing digitised Te Reo Māori collections was to gain family knowledge. And as mentioned before, 95% shared with others. Somebody said, the convenience of this information has been pivotal to including some whānau and whānau decisions. Another outcome was an increasing critical awareness about Māori language revitalisation in the Māori language strategy, and 65% of our respondents stated that using digital Te Reo Māori collections, they had used digital Te Reo Māori collections for language revitalisation initiatives. So it's very easy for us to then say, because we had collected and managed and provided access to something, and then we've got evidence of this use, therefore it connects up with this outcome in the Māori language strategy. It was very easy for us to then have conversations with the Māori Language Commission and our colleagues and senior government officials about the contribution that archival collections make to that. Similarly, our Treasury has a framework, it's called the Higher Living Standards Framework, and it's got 5 pillars. It's like economic growth, environmental sustainability, improving equality, managing risk, and one is called social capital, which they've recently changed to social cohesion. And social cohesion for Treasury, and so this is the people who divvy out the money to government departments, they articulated social cohesion as being evidence of the social connectedness through trust in institutions, evidence of identity, or communities being able to see themselves in the services of government departments, and that rights and entitlements are upheld as part of a rule of law. And there were 3 of the 5 components of social cohesion that contributes to the higher living standards. It's pretty easy for us in these findings to connect up to that pillar of the higher living standards framework. Evidence of identity with government services. 49% of our respondents experienced an outcome of personal enlightenment. 54% experienced an outcome of gaining family knowledge, as I mentioned before. Interestingly, 25% of respondents added the collections to an iwi repository, so taking from one institution and putting in the repository of an iwi. There's a whole lot more to find out about that. In terms of rights and entitlements, 22% experienced an outcome of being able to contribute to the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process that's going on in New Zealand. And that whanaungatanga that I talked about before, I think, explicitly or very strongly links to that social connectedness through trust in institutions, that sharing system that's resulted from gaining access and using digital Te Reo Māori collections. So this has been quite useful for me, and for our institution, who can now say that research from Victoria University and the National Library of New Zealand proves that through digitisation of Te Reo Māori and other collections, I put the and other in there, proves that, or shows a strong connection that it contributes to improving the living standards of New Zealanders. Takes quite a lot in terms of a cultural sort of shift in the library to encourage our senior leaders to speak in that way. But the logic's quite clear. The paper I'm writing to Treasury at the moment is sort of articulating this. We collect something, we manage it and look after it, we provide access to it, digital or online. Then there used to be this gap, but now we can say, and there is a social connectedness that's happening. Research shows that there's a social connectedness that's happening as a result of using archival collections therefore we are contributing to improving the living standards of New Zealanders. And I didn't quite realise it until I wrote this that we were really missing that gap, that evidence base of what was happening with collections, how were they being used, what difference was it making to the lives of people, to then, in terms of improving the narrative and the value proposition of an archival institution, to be able to connect up to these sort of broad strategic government outcomes. The very last sort of thing I'll speak about is we asked a range of questions about the relationship between digital and physical in the original, one of which was around the wairua, or the life force within a collection, the extent to which that had been changed or still existed in the transformation from original to digital, and the extent to which people felt the need to then view an original, or whether or not they were experiencing the collection in digital original form mattered. We kind of got about a 50-50 split in terms of the extent to which the wairua had been changed, or whether there was a need to view the physical, or whether there was a difference in the physical or original. So we've got much more research to do to kind of unpick some of that stuff, but we have got an indication of there being some pretty interesting findings there that we need to go into further detail to unpick. I will finish with a quote we received. I'll tweet it out and maybe put something out online afterwards, but a link to the full report is available on the internet via the National Library website. And we did ask we did try to get a lot of narrative in order to help sort of hear the voices. I've spoken mainly about quantitative stuff, but here's one quote I particularly like. I recently, through the use of digital repositories, was able to identify and visit an ancient pa site, fortified village, site of our ancestor. Many people have said that they knew where it was but could not tell me. I have now, through this media, located others and have just finished a wānanga, conference type thing, involving cultural mapping of wāhi tapu and pa sites. None of our kaumātua, our elders, were aware of the sites shown, and in fact were deeply and emotionally moved in a positive way. We have lost so much, the digital age has allowed us to reclaim some of it back. There's a range of things to sort of unpick underneath that, but that really spoke to me quite strongly about... Is that better? Yes. It kind of spoke to some of my drivers or motivations for being an archivist. Yes, much more to do. We've sort of, these findings are quite broad and narrow and sort of provide some indications of things happening. There's much more to do in terms of unpicking some of that and diving deeper into the findings. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Koutou rā kua whakarau I ka mai ke raro I te maru o te whare tāhua nei, tēnā koutou katoa, mōrena. I te tuatahi, ka tautoko nā mihi kia nā iwi kāinga o te rohi nei o ahi te reiria, nā tangata moimoia. Ka mihi hoki ki o rātou kaumātua kuia I mua, I naia nei, I nā tau ke teke mai. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Paul Diamond tēnei no Ngāpuhi, Te Rarawa, me Ngāti Haua, me Ngāti Pākehā, e mahi ana kei te whare pukapuka Alexander Turnbull, kei te puna mātauranga o Aotearoa, ki Pōneke, ki Aotearoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora and good morning, everyone. So part 3 of the New Zealand experience. I'm Paul Diamond. I'm from 3 tribes in New Zealand through my father, Ngāpuhi and Te Rarawa in the far north of New Zealand, and Ngāti Haua in the Waikato in the central North Island, and my mother was Pākehā, or European. And I'm the Māori curator at the Alexander Turnbull Library, Research Collections at the National Library of New Zealand. I've had that role since about 2011. And this morning what I'm doing is just giving a bit more of the context for this research that you've been hearing about from Gillian and Mark. Talking a bit about the background to digitisation in my country at our library and in other collections, and our relationships with iwi, tribes and other Māori groups, and the direction this has taken because of digitisation. So In terms of digitisation in New Zealand, it's probably similar to what's happened here and in other countries. It was images that sort of led the way. We had a website called Timeframes, which kicked off in 1997, which I think was quite early. So that was just pretty much just images. It was a single image database. And then published material followed on, and that included these things called newspaper, Māori language newspapers that were produced from the 1840s up to 1933. Actually not done by the National Library, done by one of our universities, the University of Waikato, and actually done, I think, before Papers Passed, which is our sort of equivalent of Trove, which came along a little bit later. Papers Passed now does include the newspaper, which I'll talk about in a minute, that's sort of made that more accessible. We've got things like the New Zealand Electronic Text Centre at Victoria University, which has been digitising books and other published material. And then manuscripts material came a lot later and included things like a collection of nearly 3,000 letters to one of our most significant politicians in the 19th century involved with the transfer of land from Māori to Europeans, called Donald Maclean. So nearly 3,000 letters. It's the biggest collection of Māori language letters that's known to exist. And that was put online along with transcriptions, digital images, and working translations, making it accessible to scholars who couldn't actually engage with Māori language. So then there's also been databases that have drawn on those collections. So for example, He Pātaka Kupu Ture, the legal Māori archive, which has got 400,000 19th century texts. So I was really struck by a comment that a Māori academic made when he said to me that probably the collection of Māori language written material is probably the largest collection of any Indigenous language material in the world. That's because our treaties, well, the Treaty of Waitangi, was in English and in Māori. And in places like Canada, the treaties were not in the individual Indigenous languages. They were either in English and French. So, and like in this country, there are many, many languages, whereas in New Zealand we have one language with some dialects, but we still are able to understand each other. And the decision of the missionaries to proselytise, to evangelise in Māori, so they had to cross the beach and learn Māori themselves before they could try and convert Māori, had a profound effect because that introduced a technology that Māori kind of seized on. And in the early years of European settlement in New Zealand, Māori were more literate than the European population. And so as a result, we've got this extraordinary corpus of material, which, as Mark's mentioned, has great potential now as we're trying to save our language, which is still not out of the woods, even though we are still using it. So lessons from this experience. I think some of our Māori language researchers have said that the great thing about things like this Māori legal database is that it illustrates that Māori was a language of civil society. And it's inspiring because it means, well, it could be again. And it won't be in the same way as it was in the 19th century. But I think I take a lot of inspiration from that sort of lesson, that we could get back to that point. They say we lost this language in a generation and we can hopefully get it back and not too many more. Material is more useful, I think, if you can see it in relation to other material. So just to give you an example of the sort of scholarship that's coming out in my country at the moment, this book came out last week, He Reo Wahine, Māori Women's Voices from the 19th Century. It's a collaboration of a couple of historians who are actually partners in life, a Māori woman who is an expert in Māori women's history, and her Pākehā partner who's an expert in Māori language. And so what they decided to do was just to look through the archive and how can we find women's voices? And it was interesting when they talked about, they've grouped it by themes. So petitions, this is a chapter looking at legal encounters and testamentary acts. They've sort of analysed women's wills from that period, as well as other legal records. But they'd say here, with the Māori woman signed legal documents, attended and presented claims before the Native Land Court, and came before the regular courts as victims, defendants and witnesses. Examining records created out of legal acts helps unravel the particular ways in which English law impacted upon and shaped Māori women's lives. Such a project is enhanced by digitisation, which has enabled greater access to a variety of sources that expose the everyday engagements of individuals with the law and the legal system and its functionaries, as well as the impact of the law upon families and communities. So that's the kind of engagement with these sources we're talking about that's happening in the academy among some of our sort of Māori academics. And also, but these researchers and users, This may be completely obvious to everybody here, but it really hit me how the relationship with our researchers has changed quite profoundly in not really that long a period. I was at we have an annual Māori History Symposium, and this one was in Bluff at the bottom of the South Island in New Zealand. And a researcher was telling me he'd been using the Māori newspapers to research the anniversary of a battle in his tribal area that involved some of his ancestors, and he hadn't set foot in the library. He'd been using those Donald Maclean letters, he'd been using the Māori newspapers, and it suddenly hit me that, you know, we don't have the same sorts of relationships we used to have. You know, it used to be that the Turnbull Library knew everybody who was using Donald Maclean's letters and would be able to track them appearing in books. And I know this is obvious, but it really sort of hit me about what are the implications of that. And that, to me, means, in my role as a subject curator, means, well, how do I get in front of those people? How do I engage with those people? Which I think is the beauty of this research, is that it's given us, it made us think about these opportunities for dialogue, which, and I really liked what Vern Harris was talking about yesterday, about that sort of purposeful approach to that. He was talking about, you know, convening of safe enough spaces for meaningful and effective negotiation. And yeah, I think that kōrero yesterday was really useful in terms of being real and clear about what sort of engagement you're able to have within the constraints of your institution. So, we've got agreements with tribes as part of our treaty settlement process, which we've nearly finished all the historical claims in New Zealand. There are some contemporary claims to go. So we've got about 5 agreements with tribes, and that's to help them gain access to the material in our collections that relates to those tribes. So that's good because it creates an opportunity to engage with the tribes. It's also, in one case, we're helping the tribes with their own aspirations for digitisation. So Ngāti Haua, one of my tribes, has a building called Te Kaufanga-nui, which was the site of a Māori parliament at one stage, and that has a remarkable collection of documentation which the tribe wants to digitise. So our field conservator is helping them work through the process for how to digitise that. So we're not just looking at our own collections. But actually, we're also finding that working with other Māori organisations who aren't tribal organisations is also important. So last week, we put the first of our audiovisual collections online, and it actually happened to be material from Te Reo Irirangi o Te Puko Tsika, which was the first Māori radio station in New Zealand, which has just celebrated its 30th birthday. They've worked collaboratively with the library to digitise that material. What was interesting about that was that we worked with the trustees of that radio station who worked with families to check that they were okay about things being made available online. And the chair of the trustees came into the library one day and said to my colleagues, look, you've got to realise when you're putting these things online, you're bringing people back from the dead. You know, and that's, I think, quite a valuable thing for my Pākehā colleagues to hear, that not all Māori may see it like that, but some do. And to understand the wairua, as Mark was talking about, the spiritual sort of component of this and what you're actually doing with this, the implications of putting this digitised material online. So I'm really excited about that because I think it's a template for us to be working with other groups. Then the second example is a group called Te Reo Taranaki. So we have regional organisations who are trying to revive regional language. This is Taranaki on the west coast of the North Island. We have a collection of letters that we've called the Atkinson Māori Letters from Taranaki. It's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, Arthur Atkinson was a bush ranger, the name of the sort of militia who were engaged in battle with Māori in that part of New Zealand in the 1860s. These letters were taken from 2 settlements that were attacked and destroyed. And then they find their way, they are published in the newspaper, which he also edited, as evidence of the Māori intelligence of what Māori were up to at that particular time. They find their way to the Turnbull Library as part of the collection of the Polynesian Society. They become regarded as one of the gems of our collection because they are letters between Māori. So if someone scooped up your office and put it in an archive, that would be, you know, between you and people you knew. But as we don't actually have much in our archives like that, the stuff that survived is the letters to the governor, letters to the prime minister, that sort of thing. And then we decide to digitise this, and then we start talking about it, and then we get growled at by the tribe, saying, well, who are you talking to in the tribe about this? And then, of course, you get into this chicken and egg situation, and so you say to people, what about these letters? And they go, well, what letters? And we go, well, we can't show them to you because we can't make them available online. But Te Reo Taranaki have actually been helping us engage with the tribes in that area. They've used a pilot sample of letters that actually weren't related to particular tribes, tribal language experts have transcribed those, done summary translations, and they've prepared this fantastic workbook that they're going to take out to work with iwi members on marae, our sort of traditional settlements. So they've created a model for engagement in partnership with us that we couldn't do. And it's not about us offloading this responsibility onto them. It's about us trusting them, actually, that word that's already been used in this session this morning. We've given them the digital sets of the letters, and we're working collaboratively with them because our boss said to us, I'm not comfortable with those going online until you can give us some assurance that the community are comfortable about that. But it's not straightforward to just take the Māori of the 1860s, just like it wouldn't be straightforward taking the English of the 1860s and understanding the context. So those are two really good models for what we're doing. You can see then how they feed into the language strategy that Mark mentioned, and our library has a plan to digitise all its Māori language collections by 2030. So of course, this sort of experiences that I've been telling you about will inform that. So finally, just to tell you about this, a principle that comes out of a treaty, one of the most unusual treaty claims that's been in New Zealand, called the Y262 claim, which was lodged in 1991 by 6 claimants from 6 iwi. And it's over, it wanted recognition of rights around and control of traditional Māori knowledge, customs and relationships with the natural environment. So it was a huge sort of scope, this report, but it had part of it that looked at when the Crown controls Mātauranga Māori, the phrase that Mark used, Māori knowledge. So it considered the work of the library and archives sector in New Zealand. And a report was produced in 2011 called Aotearoa Tēnei. This is Aotearoa, this is New Zealand. And the Waitangi Tribunal, which produced the report, found that tribes have roles and mana, or authority, as kaitiaki, or guardians of their cultural and intellectual property. But it also found that institutions have a right to collect and care for taonga, or treasures, as they're known in Māori. It said that Māori have a strong treaty-based interest in documentary and other Mātauranga Māori held by the Crown, but there are also important reasons to maintain relatively free public access, and especially Māori public access. So, for example, one of the reasons that's important is that we now know that nearly 1/5 of Māori don't live in New Zealand. A lot of them, you probably know, live here. My cousins and my aunts, who are spread across the country, and they're in London and they're in the States, they're all over the place. But it's quite a significant diaspora. So the tribal experts may be in Perth or Brisbane, you know. So people are not necessarily getting information through their own communities. So I thought that was a really interesting principle that the tribunal pulled out. It said that, of course, if there are restrictions, you respect that, but the presumption should be that material should be open rather than locked up unless you can get permission from the relevant traditional owners. So it's quite a different model. But they also said that there should be a provision for kaitiaki, people with an interest in that, to go, hang on, we're not comfortable with how that's being made available, how that's being disseminated, and there'll be a process to work that through. The government hasn't actually responded to that report, but we still take quite a lot of heart, I think, from that principle there. So 2 final challenges that we're grappling with. One of our language scholars said that basically all the Māori that's being written at the moment is happening in social media. So, and I was a judge for the New Zealand Book Awards for a few years, and we had a lot of trouble finding Māori language entries, as opposed to bilingual entries. There really isn't a lot of publishing and writing going on purely in Māori. But if that's the case, if it's all happening in social media, we are, I don't know about your institutions, but we're having a lot of trouble archiving things like Twitter and Facebook because of the proprietary sort of rights issues and things. So that's something we're thinking about. And then this thing, whakapapa, genealogical information, your family trees and things, that is sensitive among many Māori. There's a collection that we made available online. Their family were adamant, the depositor was adamant there'd be no restrictions on access. We've kept in touch with the family who are comfortable with the digitisation, but as recently as 2 weeks ago, in a meeting with the tribe, it was raised as an issue that we were making this available and we were charging money for supplying this. And it's still an issue. So actually the tribal leader at that meeting said that there's a growing democratisation of what was rare knowledge. We just have to figure out how to work with that. So, but going back to what Vern said, I think the great thing is to be able to have this dialogue and that we are in front of these people, we are actually able to get out of our comfort zones and actually be engaged with these issues. So, Finally, just to finish, a colleague of ours who was involved in the moving of our three of our fundamental constitutional documents, the Treaty of Waitangi, the Declaration of Independence, which was 5 years before that in the far north, and the women's suffrage petition, a woman was brought in, an archivist, a Māori archivist, to help us build relationships with the iwi, the tribes where the treaty and those other documents were signed. And she sent an email about how she had circulated a letter from one of the Māori newspapers from 1893 that the archivist who worked on the project had sent her because she knew it was from her tribal area. And so the exhibition was called He Tohu. And she said, this is the note she sent to the project team. She said, today my cousins, one attended the He Tohu opening with his mother, who was a special guest. Today my cousins sent this letter out to all of our whanaunga, relatives in Whangaroa, which is in the north of the North Island. Something for them to celebrate Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, Māori Language Week, which was last week. Hopes, aspirations, words in our unique dialect directly from one of our tupuna ancestors. I happen to know, because I have a relationship, that the revitalisation of Te Reo Māori, and in particular the dialect of the people of Whangaroa, is really important to them at the moment. So is the settlement of their claims and the planning for their future as a collective of Ngāpuhi Hapu, or sub-tribes. I know that the people at home will absolutely pore over this transcript. It will be the same for any other region that have a special project or focus. So just another example to add to the ones that Gillian and Mark told you about, and it's consistent with Ricky's definitions of the impacts and significance of making this material available. Kia ora.
Okay, so I'm going to follow on talking about some projects at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as traditional owners of the land. My name is Kirsten Thorpe. I'm manager of Indigenous services at the State Library. My family are Warramai people from Port Stephens in New South Wales. And I guess a lot of the things that I'm talking about today have come together from many years of working both at the State Archives of New South Wales with closed records relating to Aboriginal people and then on digital projects relating to Indigenous research. So what I'm going to do today is take you through a quick case study of a project that I landed in when I went to the State Library of New South Wales related to the Rediscovering Indigenous Languages project. I guess I want to talk about what Ricky was reflecting on, both the positive and the negative impact of access to collections. But then I want to take more of a reflection on the organisational change that has happened as a result of that project and talk a little bit about the things that we're thinking about into the future. We've got members of my team here in the room from Indigenous Services. I'd like to acknowledge all of their contribution to this work too. So in 2011, I went over to the State Library of New South Wales and, in 2014, right at the end of this project that was basically brought about to identify and make accessible language collections relating to Aboriginal people that were held in the State Library of New South Wales. A significant collection, but for the people that had been in looking at language material, it was widely acknowledged that the collections were highly dispersed. So we're talking about Aboriginal language lists from across Australia, whether they were written in Banks's notebooks, in the First Fleet journals, through to settlers, anthropologists, a whole range of people. The project focus was around identifying material. We had expert linguist Dr. Michael Walsh, heavily involved in research with the library and adding a lot to our understanding. In the investigation phase of the project, we identified over 200 resources, we kind of say in round numbers, relating to over 100 different Aboriginal language groups right across Australia. And one of the main outcomes that was being discussed when I ended up at the library was the building of a website to enable access. And we did things like added IATSIS language descriptions and thesaurus links so it was easy to access. So in terms of that conversation about outputs, outcomes compared to impact, what we know that we achieved is that we identified material, we were able to talk about material that was significant. We had specialists engaged, we had librarians updating catalogue records. We did a lot of preservation work, so we rehoused materials, we digitised the collections, and we did the project website. We did a lot of work in terms of connecting with key groups like First Languages Australia, working with linguists and communities. And our team proactively went out to communities to do outreach and engagement. But I would have to say that in terms of dialogue, most of the conversation was happening informally through relationships between Indigenous staff and communities. Some of the fun things that we've been able to do from the project is working a lot with data. So we've put material onto an online transcription tool where people can go in. If you ever have a spare few minutes and want to join in, you can go and start to do some transcription. And that's enabled us to have some experimental projects launched through our Digital Experience Lab. And we've approached this very much as an opening up of conversation. And for me, in my role, it's very much about starting a conversation with community. But I guess what I want to focus on is the lessons learned. I was incredibly frustrated getting to the library that, as Ricky explained in the beginning, the output from this project was, let's release a website, let's put all this stuff online and people will find it. Critical things and lessons learned around ownership, intellectual property. So what's access versus digital repatriation? Because to me, if we're talking about digital repatriation, we're actually talking about people having the privilege or the right to manage information in the way they want to. We know from the projects that we're working on through the DX Lab that if anyone goes to the website, we have huge warnings at the beginning, basically saying this information could all be wrong. So we're very much positioned access to those collections as being very much contested. We know from our many conversations with communities that we're not only dealing with the issue that Paul was talking about of material being from another era, but that in many cases it was recorded incorrectly. So how do we actually grapple with that complexity online is something that we've been thinking about. The work that I think Shannon will touch on the right of reply, has been incredibly evident. There is no Indigenous voice. I think from the 200 collections that were identified, there were 2 written by Aboriginal people. So we've got this real imbalance of perspective. And we weren't able in any of our dissemination to have that context and feedback loop back into our systems. So we've been thinking about that. And I think in terms of the simple thing of it being a website, that the user experience was very much from a library or archive perspective. It wasn't about community experience, although we tried as best as we could. And we have a lovely interface. I don't think it really speaks to communities or scholars engaging with the content in the way that we want. So, in short, I think we did a lot of dissemination, but we didn't do a lot of transformation. One of the things that we did as part of the project in reflecting on that is looked at some of the things that we were talking about as being our principles. So the State Library of New South Wales is a part of the National State Libraries of Australasia, and we have this policy statement that says things like we respect the right for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be informed about their language, and that we see Aboriginal people as custodians. But what I was seeing was probably opposite. We were just putting stuff out there and not actually having that dialogue that's been discussed a lot. So we did a little bit of research with the Centre for the Dynamics of Language at Western Sydney University, and we went out to a number of communities asking these questions. What does good access look like? What do users want? But when the researchers, so Dr. Sophie Nichols and Lauren Booker were the people that worked with us, when they went out, they realised that, you know, a lot of the questions that were being asked were around the distrust, how do you build relationships, and how do you actually manage the concerns. I think we've always had that understanding that there's always that balance between trauma and excitement in accessing the collections. So the findings of the research undertaken by Sophie and Lauren had 4 major themes as a response. And the first and the most primary response to access to our collections was around painful remembrance. and really bringing out the tensions of who recorded this knowledge, as well as the issues of intellectual property. People talked a lot about access. People wanted to be able to access digital collections, but I think the overwhelming response was that the relationship needed to be there in the beginning, and perhaps the State Library of New South Wales hadn't engaged as fully as was needed. There was a lot of discussion around the assessment of the archival value. So what was the veracity of the content that was collected? Was it correct? Was it, a mistruth? Where was it sitting? Or was it actually the most spectacular document and a real treasure? So getting that balance. And the ongoing discussion around custodianship and who actually has a right to determine that. So our lessons learned, I think, very much. I talked to my colleagues about this yesterday. What do we say about this project? It was funded well. People talk about it being a landmark project in terms of identifying language material. And I would have to say, from my perspective, that it taught the organisation a lot about what it was doing wrong, or perhaps could be doing better. So I hope that the transformation has actually been an internal one for the organisation to start thinking about and seriously thinking about its commitment to working with communities. One of the things that I'm really interested in was raised yesterday, the digital infrastructure, how we actually build these spaces in an ongoing way so that community access and keeping places are created. So I'll finish up by talking about the things we're thinking about in the future. Where at the moment, we've probably gone beyond a bit of a pilot stage now, but we're doing a lot of training with Washington State University around the Muktu system, looking at how we can actually enable community keeping places so that it's not just the State Library being the custodians of this material, but that we're actually empowering new archivists of the future, new librarians to be managing and looking after content locally. So we are very excited about the Muktu project, because for us it's about being in a community of practice. We know that there will be a lot of challenges, but hopefully if we work together we can start to knock them out. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try and keep it to 5 minutes as well, but we'll see how we go. It's been interesting over the last... first off, I'm Shannon Faulkhead. I'm a research fellow with the Monash Country Lines Archive in the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre at Monash University. Yes, we know that there's too many Monashes, but... and I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on the land that we're meeting today. It's been interesting over the last couple of days with the discussion with this group, just thinking about impact and how it affects people. So, and possibly, as Lynette was saying yesterday, affects. So I'm just going to, I suppose, tell a bit of a story to try and explain where I'm coming from. I'm a Koori woman from Mildura, but I was unaware of my background until my teens. It was never a secret, it just, there's a whole background to that story which I really don't have time to go into today. When I moved to Melbourne, I was working at the Koori Heritage Trust for 9 years, and my first job at the Trust was that I was the librarian. And it was an interesting, even though it was a tiny library, it was a very interesting experience in the sense that I got to understand that I wasn't the only person that didn't know that much about my background or Aboriginal history or Aboriginal past. There were a lot of other people. And I had the great opportunity working at an organisation of allowing people access to documents and material that they hadn't had access to before. And sometimes the responses were shock, horror, distress, but they weren't always negative. It was also that option of then digesting that and working out how that impacts on their lives and where they wanted to take that information further. So, And it also was, I think it was where I first experienced something that was said to me recently, that people started remembering things that they thought they'd forgotten, or they didn't realise that it was Indigenous knowledge because they didn't have the context. It was information that had been passed down to them from family, but they didn't understand where it fitted in their lives or their communities. So I then was presented with another opportunity through Monash University, where I was successful in a PhD scholarship with the Trust and Technology Project. And the Trust and Technology Project was an interesting one in the sense that it was looking at archiving Indigenous oral memory, actually developing a system to archive. But as the project developed, it became aware that they needed to take a step back in a way and actually look at, well, in what situation should oral memory be recorded? So it became the socio-technical specifications instead of actually building the system. From that, the team did an amazing amount of interviews across Victoria. And one of the things that came across was, because people didn't know what were in these collections, in archival collections, and they were starting to become aware of it, it wasn't just oral memory that they wanted to speak about. They also wanted to be able to give their feelings about archival institution records in terms of how they can have some sort of control, not just access, but some sort of control over how they're accessed by others. So some people weren't saying we just don't want them accessible, but we want to be able to control how they're accessed. So it might be they just want to share it with their family first so that they can get to understand it, or their community, and then possibly make them public. But in saying that, some of the institutional records are very personal documents, and they may not want, and even though it might be about their great-great-grandmother, it's still that family connection, there's still intergenerational trauma associated with that they may not want those accessible. I was then given another opportunity in this area after my PhD to work for the Monash Country Lines Archive. For those that don't know what it is, it's a project that is between the Faculty of IT in the Sensi Lab and the Arts Faculty, the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre, working on using 3D animation to preserve and, not in a way kind of archive, but is also an intergenerational tool for Indigenous languages. So that's how it started. We don't, it may become later that it be other cultural knowledge as well, but at the moment it is Indigenous languages. And we are currently working with 8 groups across Australia. With that project, it is a digitisation project in the sense that people are bringing their knowledge. Sometimes they may still speak the language. Other groups are actually researching the language and creating scripts from their learnings and then putting them into the animation. So they're also doing their own research and process and bringing those records together with their own records that they held within family and within themselves over generations. From that, and it's something that we've been discussing for quite a while, that we haven't yet researched the impact on that. We have anecdotal stories that we can share about how it's impacted on communities, but nothing that we could go and say, this has been a success or a failure, because, which I don't want to do anyway. I don't think that that's a way of looking at this sort of research. So I guess in a way, just thinking today when I was listening to the rest of the panel, where I'm coming from is a bit of a different situation in that I don't actually work with institutional archival collections. I'm working with the people and the records that they hold. And I'm still negotiating that space as to how that operates, but I still find it a very exciting space. And what I find exciting is that it's constantly changing as they interact with other collections. So it's a living, continuous archive that I'm working with, and that's a very exciting place for me to be working. I think I might stop there because I'm very conscious that there might be people that want to ask questions. But before I do, I would like to, on behalf of the rest of the panel, and I'm sure that they will tell you as well, Ricky, thank you very much for bringing us here and for your passion, and we so look forward to working with you on this into the future.